How you doing?
Great, very good.
Welcome.
So we're going to try a Q&A format, which should be interesting. So I met Aaron 6 years ago. Actually, 6 years ago, minus 1 week. I tried to acquire him.
You tracked this?
Yes.
Wow.
So we had dinner at 5:30, 2007.
Yeah, that was lunch for me. So.
Yeah, exactly. I tried to buy Box for $10 million, which he immediately said no to.
Just picture the YouTube dinner at Denny's with Chad and Steve and Larry and Eric or whoever that was, and it was just me and Keith.
So. No, we had Dave, I think.
We had Dave. Yeah, we have Dave Sanford. So
exactly.
That was quite exciting.
But if I'd offered you,
it was like less than $10 million. So
it was less than $10 million.
It was like a Tumblr kind of style deal right there.
But at the time, you were how many employees?
Probably 10. So, yeah, these were not the days of Instagram.
No, and he'd raised about $1.5 million.
Yep.
And you had about 500,000 users, maybe 1 million?
Yes, yeah, I think something around there.
So how did you think about it back then? Like when someone offers to buy your company, what went through your brain?
Let me just first address the elephant in the room. This is a fascinating titling of the session. Could you not have chosen a different adjective than great? It's just like the most awkward title of all time. Like it's like managing fascinating growth.
I wasn't in charge.
Okay.
Explosive growth.
Yeah, something more a little bit like illustrious. So what was the question again?
So how did you think about? I mean, you must have. All on the way from the very beginning to probably pretty recently, you've probably had acquisition offers. How do you think about that as CEO when someone makes a tangible offer? What are the calculations that you do?
Yeah. So the first question we ask is I was going to make a slide joke, so I apologize. Did you give context of where you were at the time?
Yeah, I was working at a company called Slide. We built applications on top of MySpace primarily at the time, and then we're just launching on Facebook. Facebook platform had launched that week, actually about 4 days earlier.
Right. So, we actually surprisingly haven't gotten ourselves into too many of those kind of conversations. But we did get into one a couple years ago, which was a very kind of strategic kind of question that we were facing, and we ultimately decided that obviously to stay the course, and that was actually that was probably the last time that we kind of ever decided even to think about it, and we've kind of been pretty heads down since then. Ben Horowitz actually had a really good kind of way of thinking about it, which is if you don't have any interest in selling, do not even start the conversation. It really fucks with your entire sort of psyche and your board and your co-founders and everybody involved in the process, because all of a sudden you start to sort of extrapolate out so many different things than what you were kind of originally intending as a business. And so he was totally right about that, because we did sort of engage in a conversation just to sort of test the waters of what was the market like, what could the possibility be there, and ultimately we had no conviction about actually selling the company. So it was a very it then ended up kind of creating just interesting sort of fractures that we ultimately resolved, and we ultimately kind of came through, and everybody kind of came to the exact same answer. But it was a very sort of mentally straining experience.
So let's go way back. So you started the company when you were in college.
Mm-hmm.
And your dorm room, according to the official story and saga, you started as a consumer company, which is probably more normal for someone who's 21. How did you get into enterprise?
Yeah, well, so we were actually 19 and 20 at the time. Started the company our sophomore year of college, and started with my co-founder. He was at Duke, I was at USC, and started with him. Yeah, he was really, really good.
So you had a good basketball program.
Yeah, we were. Not me, but actually, it turned out we had a good football program. It turned out, I guess, everybody was just stealing money to make that work. But we started the company. My co-founder was really, really good at online poker. So he was designated as the sort of funder of the business. And actually, he was like it was actually a really kind of fascinating kind of time, because he'd have like 4 screens or like 8 screens going at any time. So if you happened in like 2004, 2005 to be playing online poker against somebody at like 3 in the morning, it was probably him. And he would just take 50 cents at a time, just constantly building up the rake from the table. So he funded the company. We started it. And
he's now your CFO.
He's our CFO, naturally. That qualifies him. So we built up the business, and actually we ultimately caught the attention of Mark Cuban, and he ultimately funded the company. So we decided to drop out of college in 2005, and then we came to the Bay Area, and then kind of built things up from there. So that was the original kind of background on that.
So actually, the official legacy is that you sort of sent a cold email to Mark?
Yes.
Is that true?
It is. We also the part of the legacy that nobody else kind of hears about is all of the cold emails we sent to other people that didn't get responses. So it's actually funny. Is Bill Gates in the audience? Probably not. Okay, so we actually faxed him a letter You couldn't. I don't think we could get his email address, but he had an office that had a fax line. So we actually faxed him a prospectus, and he didn't really respond. So that was too bad. But we also dropped off a printed prospectus to Paul Allen into his house. That was also probably really strange for him, and he didn't fund the company either. But you know, we tried lots of investors. Cuban was the one person crazy enough to respond to 2 random kids on the internet, and then ultimately funded the company.
Cool. So now let's talk about how you got from a consumer application into enterprise.
Yeah, sure. That's the question?
Yeah.
Okay. Because that was sort of more of a period at the end of that. But so we or maybe a colon or something. So
did they teach English at USC?
For a couple weeks. So we realized that in kind of 05 and 06 that there were sort of you know, the space that we're in is we help businesses store, share, manage, and kind of access their data from anywhere. And we started out in the consumer space, but we realized that the economics of the space were that, you know, what you're trying to do is get some amount of consumers to some percentage, 3-5%, to be able to upsell by, you know, putting lots of storage online and then paying for more space. And that was the consumer proposition. And we're familiar with this with a lot of other kind of companies. But what we realized was the challenge with that is other companies have way better economic propositions because they can actually monetize the consumer product proposition through other means, so advertising or subsidize it through other products that they're delivering, and we wouldn't have the same ability to go do that. We would have to still be able to directly have the consumer upsell proposition. So we thought that, you know, Google and Apple and Microsoft, and at the time we thought even Yahoo, which then became less relevant for 5 years and now is relevant again, but we basically thought that one of those companies was going to subsidize this kind of service, and if not one of them, many of them, which would be even worse. And so the economics were going to be very, very challenging over the long run in the consumer side. Whereas in the enterprise space, in the consumer space, everybody's just trying to save as much money as possible on their applications that they're using or their services that they're using. Everybody's very price sensitive. In the enterprise, you're actually much more focused on what is the ROI, what is the productivity gain, what is the efficiency gain I'm getting as a business. And when we went and looked inside of enterprise environments as to what they were spending their money on, we realized that most of the other solutions in the enterprise were priced at 10 to 100 to 1,000 times what we were charging for. So it was actually a really, really straightforward decision. At least in retrospect, at the time, there was a lot of cultural implications to going this route. But we decided that in the enterprise market, where, you know, I think now is obviously quite kind of trite to say this is, you have very cumbersome, complex legacy infrastructure and systems that businesses have to maintain. And when you deliver that over the web or through the cloud, it becomes much cheaper and it's much easier for people to implement those solutions. So we realized we had a sort of disruptive model that was ultimately going to be also a much better business model in the enterprise market.
So what were the primary cultural sort of considerations and challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, the really obvious one, and I guess David Sachs talked about sales earlier today. So the really obvious one is like just you do actually layer on a new kind of culture in your organization. You add a sales team, and so what we were picturing in our heads at the time, you know, again, we were at this point kind of 21, 22. You know, we're just trying to build cool products on the internet, and we're picturing, you know, these enterprise sales sort of beefy, sort of like guys that come in and they have a briefcase, and then in the briefcase is another briefcase, and then they pull up in a Ferrari with like 6 gold rings, and that was sort of what was in our head about what building an enterprise software company was going to be like. And their name was probably Chuck or something, and so or Chad or Ches, and no offense if that was like everybody's name in this room. So that was sort of what we were fearing in our head, and we realized that, okay, so we don't really want to build a traditional enterprise model. We want to do things a little bit differently, and I expect that sort of David talked about the Yammer model, which is, you know, quite similar. We also realized that we didn't want to have to be sort of beholden to the same limitations that traditional enterprise software companies dealt with. So the very obvious one is you end up having to drive a lot of your product roadmap from sort of the RFPs that people create in the space. And so we also didn't want to limit our innovation to just what customers were looking for and what they were trying to buy, but rather what we were trying to build for the future. So we looked at kind of a bunch of these traditional ways that enterprise software companies were created and realized, well, a lot of these dimensions actually could meaningfully change when you have a cloud-delivered solution. So the sales model obviously changes pretty dramatically just on the basis of you now have software that gets implemented into an organization often before you have a sales relationship with that organization. So you sort of invert the sales cycle where instead of having to sort of pitch somebody to buy your product, they're already using it, and then you're able to kind of upsell upsell and monetize that relationship sort of later down the road. On the innovation side, we didn't really see this in 2007, but it eventually became true, which was customers were actually sick of the legacy process of how software was built. They actually wanted much more innovative technologies. And so finally, we were at a point where sort of consumer design instincts and building for the end user became much more valued. And actually, at the time in '07, that wasn't really obvious. And it wasn't really obvious to us that that would actually happen, but it was obvious that it should happen. So we decided to still kind of focus our entire business on it. And so ultimately, we kind of put together a few sort of disruptive mechanisms of, we'll have a freemium offering, it'll be designed for the end user, we'll have an inside sales model that will monetize relationships after there's already usage inside of an organization, and we'll move at the speed and sort of the level of innovation of a consumer internet company. So we don't have to necessarily lose all of the things that we sort of found so powerful about the consumer model.
So David mentioned this morning that his biggest challenge was actually navigating the debate between the sales team and the engineering team, the product team. How have you done that, and is it as big a challenge as it was for David?
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know how big of a challenge it was for him, but I know this is probably where we spend most of our time is sort of finessing and reconciling the needs of the enterprise IT buyer with the needs and demands of the end user. And the thing that we realized ultimately, and this is different for different kinds of technology. So if you're building a back-end analytics technology, it's not always as relevant. A lot of it, and this is actually also hard for us to get our executives and organizations sort of to wrap their heads around, is in traditional enterprise software, the way that we think about traditional enterprise software is you sort of sell this large Oracle system to the IT buyer, and it's relevant for maybe, it certainly powers the entire organization, but it's really only relevant to sort of 5 or 10% of the organization in terms of actually interacting and using the software. Well, when you're building software for end users that are horizontal in nature, you always have this potential that some new technology is going to come into the organization that's going to disrupt you, which means that just because you sold the technology into the organization doesn't actually mean that you've now won that or kept that as a client, which is very different than in the days of Oracle or IBM, where if you sold the technology into the organization, you can be pretty sure that they're going to kind of maintain and integrate the system. So sort of our first principle is that the end user experience has to be incredible. And I would say that we don't always do the best job at that. Like we do often find ourselves, well, shit, for like a quarter, much of our engineering effort went into the enterprise product or the security technology. And while that was great because it won more deals and it protected us, it didn't let us get far enough along the road from an end user standpoint. And so we're sort of constantly sort of oscillating between really focused on the end user or focused on the end user, but also sort of adding in a lot of the enterprise stuff. And I'd say that we haven't even really excelled at this, but what we are trying to do is get the company to realize at all times that the end user is the first and kind of most important constituent that we need to be able to serve successfully, or else nobody's going to ultimately pay for the product.
And are you personally making those decisions, or how do they get resolved within the organization?
Yeah, so I end up getting pretty involved in those kind of things, and that's, I think, both necessary at our kind of organization, but also personally, I'm much more product focused than your typical sort of deep enterprise sort of background person.
So let's talk about your organization, because as you went from 21 people to, what are you, 750 now, or some?
820.
So as you went there, you changed the organizational model, and actually, I think you have a fairly unique one. So can you describe it, like how you work with your COO and who does what, and how you divide responsibilities?
Yeah. So we have a COO. How many people here have a COO? Like maybe a little higher. Okay. And how many people would consider themselves sort of product CEOs? Right. So what I discovered was, and we were just talking about this back there. It wasn't like a novel discovery. We just followed Zuckerberg. But what I discovered was, if you think about all of the things that sort of take your attention as CEO, you are ultimately responsible for every element of your business. There's nothing that I can't sort of take responsibility for if something goes wrong or something happens.
In fact, remember, I sent you an email about he had bought ads at the Giants Stadium.
Okay, that's good. I don't recommend that, by the way. But and by he means somebody in the organization. But again, I take responsibility. So
you had a good answer as to why.
But you can do billboards. Billboards are effective. So so what I realized was I looked at, we were about 40 employees, and I looked at my calendar and kind of all the meetings that you went to and all the emails that people were asking me questions around, and a significant portion of, we're drawing things. Oh, this
It's
is incredible.
It's a summary of all your insights.
Oh my God, this is live.
Get an autograph copy.
Okay, hey, this is okay, great. So should so I should probably say some things to screw it up. So then there was a giant flame, and I don't know where the missile came from, but it was out of nowhere. And then there were naked people everywhere. So how that happened, I don't know. So
back to COOs.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so basically, but you have to draw. I said it, and it happened. It did happen to me. This was a true thing. Okay, so basically, what was it? Shit.
So you had 40 people.
Yeah,
you looked
40
at
people.
you audited
So
your calendar, email.
You see all the things that are going on with your time, and you realize that actually the vast majority of your time is not going into things that are going to make your product better or competitively differentiate you in a disproportionate way. They are critical things. So don't get me wrong, but there are things that are dealing with making sure somebody reconciles their sort of issue with another person, or somebody needs a performance management review, or somebody has a question about like why is their salary a certain amount, or you have to have some meeting because you're moving into a new office and you're trying to figure out what are all of the things that go into that. And so you look at all of your day and you realize that a significant portion of your day is not going into things that are going to help you stay ahead of the market, that are going to help you be competitive, that are going to help you win in the space. And so it was interesting actually, and actually Vinod and I talked about this also a little bit, which was that I came to the conclusion that what we need is a chief sort of revenue officer. And this would be somebody that would just handle a lot of the day-to-day kind of like revenue operations, like some of the business financy, those kind of things, the stuff that our CFO wasn't doing. And I would still handle some of the other stuff. And ultimately, through that process, we did a lot of research, we met a lot of people, and realized that actually what we needed was a chief operating officer. And so I pitched that to the board, and the initial sort of response was, well, if you have to have a chief operating officer, and this is sort of the value of wisdom, is if you have a COO, like it's this nebulous role, nobody really knows what it is. Does it mean you're not doing your job as a CEO? And what we realized was actually this was going to be how I could kind of get much more leverage in my role and what I was going to be able to do. And so what we did was we hired what was previously a general manager of a major business unit in Intuit, who sort of thinks about the world in terms of people and operations and getting more out of people and processes and how do you run a business. And that freed me up to focus on things like how do we stay disruptive, how do we build better products than our competitors, how do we make sure we have a better platform than everybody else in the space. And ultimately that sort of basically divided the labor to allow us to sort of both run in directions that were super effective. And now the challenge, of course, is how do you actually know what are the things that you're going to share, what are the things that you're not going to share, what are you actually complementing your strengths, or are you creating a lot of redundancy in that? And that was where you spend a lot of the time and make sure that you have an effective relationship. So that's what we did. We brought in a COO, and then he's kind of helped us build up the organization. So think about him as a Sheryl Sandberg with a beard.
So one of the things that was unique, and you may have changed this subsequently, for a long time though, he was your only direct report?
Well, so I have, so it's a little bit more unique than that. So there's a lot of sort of the functional roles report to him. This is where it gets a little unique. So like our head of sales will report to him, our head of marketing reports to him. In terms of like people-related issues, our head of engineering will report to him. Design reports to me, product reports to me. But then I'm involved in the sort of strategies and the tactics of engineering and product in those areas. But I don't have to worry about sort of are we moving everything in the right direction in the best way possible. I have a counterpart that's also really spending a lot of time thinking about that, and they're not having to worry about the product strategy and the sort of competitive strategy because that's something that I'm paying attention to.
Cool. So speaking about competitive strategy, which you both pay a lot of attention to and tweet a lot about, how do you identify what your unique sort of competitive advantage is when you're a small startup, vis-a-vis these large incumbents which you compete with? What's the criteria? What's the calculation? How did you succeed yourself? Yeah,
I think that, and I think it's actually you're always sort of optimizing and iterating that, obviously. But I think at least the thing that I probably most discovered is it works is you sort of first take a look at sort of your inventory of what are your capabilities that you could be really good at, and that's a constant process of just do we have better technology? Do we have better infrastructure? Do we have better designers? Do we have better marketers? Do we have better salespeople? How do we leverage all of the strengths of those capabilities in a way that's going to be disruptive to the marketplace? And then you have to think about the marketplace side of the thing. Like your disruptive potential or your competitive advantage is not just sort of you in a vacuum. It's actually actually got to be relative to the marketplace. So what we look at is, well, okay, let's look at all of our competitors, and we have way too many to count, but there's probably 5 or so that are actually pretty important to us, and we look at all of their capabilities and what they're going to be good at in the market, and you sort of find the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. And Clayton Christensen actually has probably the best way that I've ever seen this, which is this idea of resources, processes, and values. And every company has sort of their own RPV that is associated with their business. I mean, if you can't get to 50,000 employees without building an expertise at a certain set of processes and also then creating a certain set of values. So when we compete with Microsoft, it's through being agnostic, it's through being sort of moving better for the end user, being much more open, and then through our sort of pricing disruption. When we compete with Google, those things aren't the same kind of ways that we're going to be able to win with Google. And Google, it's sort of enterprise empathy. It's being able to manage the security and privacy differently than Google's going to be able to do it. And so for all of our competition, we have a different set of list of ways that we're going to compete with them. And hopefully by having sort of the best sort of shared things across those competitors, we ultimately create the sort of most disruptive business model possible. And you're always again optimizing that because something will change in the market, and we have to update it to reflect something brand new that has happened.
So one of the other things you've done really well is you went probably about 4 years ago. I remember talking to you, and you had a calculated strategy of becoming a thought leader on cloud computing. Okay. Right? You said you may remember this chat.
You're probably not supposed to tell people that, but that's fine.
But
Thank you.
so, but it's hard for like a new company.
Calculated.
Yeah, it was very calculated. I think we were talking with your PR woman at the time.
Probably.
It's very hard for a startup though to get in that position. Right now, you're clearly a very successful company as well as the thought leader. But how did you break it down back then, and what tactics? Sort of how did you think about how you get to that position?
Yeah, I would say that. In terms of just purely tactical advice, there's probably for every company in this room, there's something that is ownable by your company and by your brand and by your position. And the best the way that we thought about it is we want as much attention in whatever category we're going to go serve to accrue to us, because that's how you're going to get buyers interested, that's how you're going to get employees interested, that's how you're going to get partners interested. And so we've just built out a strategy of how do we make sure that if people are thinking about cloud and collaboration and the disruption going on in cloud, that we are sort of at the center of that. And that was just a lot of tactics put together and a long list of things. And it's fascinating because like any individual thing wasn't that meaningful. It's just the hard work of the 100 of them that come together, which you fast forward 5 years and you're able to build up an organization and hopefully a brand that does represent something bigger than what it would have otherwise.
Cool. What's the hardest part of your job?
Probably getting to Cavallo Point, I would say. Jesus, is this like the Khosla military offsite or something? I don't know. The hardest thing is probably, honestly, you get to a certain stage where it's really fascinating. I mean, you do see, and we're at a microscopic scale of what we should be at and what we want to be at, but you do see it starts to be fascinating of how do you get people to sort of realize that you have to change. And we've been doing this for 8.5 years, so you can just already imagine that we've had to go through 2 to 3 generations of cycle of change to be able to still exist, which means that we are constantly sort of trying out new products and having to I mean disrupt yourself is sort of a little bit trite, but build things that aren't immediately obvious to our customers or our employees about why we're getting into these new markets. And that's something that you always face. And so communicating that strategy, getting everybody on board and sort of executing in the same direction, I think is probably one of the more interesting challenges that doesn't go away no matter how many organizational design changes that you do or how much process you implement. You still have to convince people to be excited by and get around the sort of mission of what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that only increases at scale. And so it's like no wonder why companies like Microsoft or SAP or Oracle or IBM have massive difficulty sort of moving the battleship, because there's just so many people that you have to be able to convince to go in that direction.
So if you were running Microsoft, what would you do differently?
Bill Gates is not here, correct?
He is.
Okay.
He's busy.
But he's not in the room.
No.
And this is not like live streaming to him. Okay. Probably bring back Bill Gates. But so then I should have asked, is Steve Ballmer in the room? Is he?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Okay. So no, it's interesting. Honestly, it's so easy from the outside to sort of think about, well, what, oh, it's so easy. It's like go cloud and consumer devices. Their last quarter was, I don't know, what, $10 to $15 billion of revenue. What was it? 50? They're now doing 50, 60, 70, $80 billion a year in revenue. It's like, and if you think about the market pressures, the market pressure will not allow them they will not allow Microsoft to slip once in a quarter, right? So if you just think about this problem, right? You are doing right now, I don't know, $60 to $80 billion a year in revenue on some business model, and the market wants you to still continue to grow, so they have to next year hit $90 billion. And every other one of your competitors has a disruptive business model that is lower cost than you. It's not really obvious that, like, okay, well, yeah, I'll make my operating system free. So no, like that's exactly how they'll get fucked in the next year in their quarterly earnings. So it's a really difficult challenge. I think that the M&A approach is actually a pretty wise strategy so far. Companies like Yammer and Skype, which are not necessarily core disruptors to them, but adjacent sort of businesses that they can get in to help transition some of their business model and some of the ways that they're making money is actually really strong. I think that they need to decide whether or not they're in the applications business or the operating system applications business, because what that's causing is this huge challenge where they can't go take things like Office and deliver them on the iPad and Android, because right now they're using that to hold up the Windows 8 strategy. So they have this weird sort of strategy tax of, I can't let all of my businesses sort of run independently and be as successful as they independently can be, because I also want to tell this integrated solution story to my customers. But when you go talk to the customers and you say, hey, customers, how do you, like, and they say, and the customer says, hey, I have so many iPads, I have iPhones, I have Android devices, how are you going to enable me to be mobile? Microsoft says Windows 8, buy lots of Surfaces. And nobody's saying, yeah, that's going to be the solution. So it's actually a really, really difficult dilemma. And long story short, I don't know the answer.
Cool. So let's.
Does anybody know the answer? I would pay you. I have a $100 bill actually, just randomly. I'll give it to you if you have the answer.
So let's take a couple questions.
Okay.
Anybody have a question for Aaron?
And if you have the answer, you should just say it. Literally $100 bill. If I believe it, Khosla will pay you.
Any questions? There's one in the back.
Okay.
If you grab.
So, can you give us a strategy, Aaron, of
okay.
Of what Box is going to do beyond storage? Like, what's the next 5 years look like for Box?
Sure. So, first of all, raise your hand if you're competing with us in any way, shape, or form. Okay, cool.
We would never fund anybody to compete with you.
I appreciate that. I didn't know that we had signed that thing. So, we've been kind of out of the storage business for a while, but I appreciate the legacy view of our space. At the back end of Box, we have lots of storage. That's the only way that you can actually store people's information. So everybody here is in the storage business in that sense. But what we try and do is have a layer above storage, which is how do you collaborate around, how do you share, how do you access your information. We just did an acquisition last week of a company called Crocodoc. They're the sort of world's best way to view documents in the cloud. So they do HTML conversion, so you can view PowerPoint files and Word documents in your browser. So we've sort of long been trying to build sort of the next generation way that you're going to consume your business information. But it is a fair question. So the next phase from there is how do we get more of that information? And I would say that the big thing that we think a lot about is this. The vast majority of data in a business, I think you experienced this in your side of the analytics part of the market and intelligence, but what we see is there's so much knowledge that is not being digitized in a business. It'll end up in, sometimes it's being digitized but not shared, so it'll end up in a Word document. Sometimes you email it to yourself. Sometimes it ends up in one of these things, less creatively, obviously, when it's in your office. Sometimes it'll be in a notepad. All of this data that is meant to be shared with other people doesn't get digitized, doesn't get collaborated around. So we see that as a pretty big opportunity, which is like, what if you can actually connect a lot more of the knowledge that people are creating and sharing inside of an organization? How would you do that with software? And the only way you would do that is not through, again, a traditional sort of like, we're going to implement this really great enterprise system with workflow and whatever. It's going to be through new, engaging, very simple tools that let people share and collaborate much more effectively and be able to consume and kind of work with all that content. So that's one thing. And then another thing that we're doing, and we've kind of gone through this phase over the past couple of years, is as you build, we have a horizontal platform, and the next stage of any horizontal platform is to verticalize. So what we're doing is not necessarily verticalizing the product, but working with new partners and new players in the ecosystem ecosystem to be able to go into different verticals and in different spaces. So we'll certainly work within new industries to be able to serve and be able to translate storage into much higher value types of propositions for customers.
So take one more question, I guess, for Node's
But
claiming.
really, if you say storage, my valuation goes down. So it's just if you can just say cloud, SaaS, enterprise software, collaboration would be good. Social.
So Aaron, I'll ask you the question lots of people here struggle with.
Yes.
Which is, in your next thing, do you do the kinds of things you talked about, which are all the things the marketplace needs, or do something really, really bold and be a cloud operating system that offers a layer of services to any application developer on their mobile device? So you're the back end for every application. Sure. That's like saying declaring war on a bunch of people. I'm not sure who's thinking of themselves as a cloud operating system, but
I think Vinod just turned this into a box brainstorming session. So, so it's something that we think about. So we think about it more as less a cloud operating system, because I think that would offend a lot of people that believe just browsers are sort of the operating system of the cloud. But more if you think about what a business operating system might look like. So if you think about all of the people in your organization and they all have knowledge that needs to be shared, and you have a bunch of applications that they're using across lots of different contexts, how does the data from those applications get shared between applications and between people? How do you see what's going on inside of your organization? There's going to be either a layer or many layers that are sort of federated below that problem that certainly we pay attention to. Companies like Salesforce, I know, think a lot about. I think it's a massive opportunity, and it's not going to. I mean, it's totally this fascinating thing which you sort of fall into it, which is you could not probably make that your vision and then go execute on that. You sort of have to have a couple killer apps and Trojan horses that cause that to be possible, and then you can sort of back end into that. And so we absolutely do think a lot about what is going to be that connective tissue of the enterprise, particularly when you think about that enterprise being much more mobile, much more distributed, probably in new kinds of geographies that just doesn't have a lot of the infrastructure that the Procter & Gamble has. But now you're in India, you're in China, you're in new markets. What is that sort of connective business fabric that's going to exist? And we think that's a massive opportunity, absolutely. But yep, nothing to announce for today.
So join me in thanking Aaron for joining us.
Thanks a lot.